Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 290, More Than Just Tea. Hi, I'm Jake. This week marks a big anniversary in Boston history, the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. I had originally planned to release an interview with an expert this week where we debunked some of the most common myths about the destruction of the tea. Events conspired against me, however. On the morning when the interview was scheduled, we had to say goodbye to our beloved dog, Duke. Duke was 14 and a half years old, and he was a very good boy. He was my constant companion for almost a third of my life. He went on daily walks with me and came along on my morning runs for over a decade. He loved cheese and peanut butter and pizza crusts. He was a champion commuter on the Orange Line, the Blue Line, and the commuter rail. He'd experienced canoes, water taxis, and high-speed ferries, and he hated them all. He did love to travel, and he visited all the New England states, from the top of Mount Washington to the tip of Cape Cod. From the trails of the Blue Hills to the Kennedy's private beach, and from Portland to Providence to New Haven to Burlington. I can't say that he loved history as much as we do, but he visited Ticonderoga, Valley Forge, and many other historic sites at our sides. I canceled the interview that I had planned, and then the crazy work schedule I've been keeping over the past few weeks kinda kept me from putting together an elaborate plan for an all-new episode. Luckily, the rest of Boston has the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party covered. There are commemorative events taking place around the city and throughout December, with the highlights being the meeting of the Body of the People at Old South and a reenactment at the Tea Party Ships and Museum, both of which will have already happened by the time you hear this. We'll leave the tea to the experts, and instead this week we'll talk about some of the other cargoes that arrived in Boston on the ill-fated tea ships. But before we talk about some of the other things that came to Boston on those tea ships, I just want to pause and thank our Patreon sponsors. These are the loyal listeners who choose to support the show with $2, $5, or even more than that each month. They help offset the costs of making Hub History. Each month I pay for things like web hosting and security, podcast media hosting, online audio processing tools, transcription, and now some AI tools that I've been trying to use to help speed production. Being able to rely on the ongoing support of our Patreon sponsors means that I can get on with researching and writing the show, and I don't have to worry so much about where the money's going to come from. So to everybody who supports the show, thank you. If you're not yet supporting the show and you'd like to start, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. Now it's time for this week's main topic. Like any lover of Boston history, I've been familiar with the events that led up to the dumping of the tea on December 16, 1773, and the impact of that act of rebellion since I was a kid. I can still remember the sketch on Sesame Street where Kermit was a roving reporter who was covering the Boston Tea Party. But, the letter T. However, I have to confess that until pretty recently, I hadn't realized that there would have been other cargoes aboard the 4 ships that brought tea to Boston in December 1773. Some of you out there may have had the chance to see the original play Phillis in Boston at the Old South Meeting House over the last few weeks. The play centers on Phillis Wheatley's efforts to secure the newly published copies of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, that were being held in the Dartmouth's hold, while debates raged as to whether the ship could be unloaded. The audience is reminded that, while questions on the fate of the tea may have foreshadowed the revolution, at the time, a lot of merchants and families just wanted to get their stuff. We've never released an entire episode about the enslaved poet Phillis Wheatley, but back in August 2021, we talked about another talented black artist who was enslaved in Boston. Scipio Moorhead, who was advertised as taking faces at the lowest rates, created the portrait of Phillis that served as the frontispiece of her book, which she must have been desperate to get unloaded off the Dartmouth before Boston's anger overflowed. A classified ad ran in the Boston Gazette starting in January 1773 and several more times that year. At Mr. McLean's, the watchmaker near the townhouse, is a Negro man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London. He takes faces at the lowest rates. Specimens of his performance may be seen at said place. Now, while there were free black people in Massachusetts in the 1770s, that was the exception rather than the rule. In almost every case, when you encounter the word Negro in print in that era, it's referring to someone who was enslaved. So this advertisement was for an enslaved black man, and taking faces meant that he could paint or draw portraits. He was displaying samples of his work at a watchmaker's shop near the building we know as the Old State House, probably on today's State Street. The February 4th, 1773 edition of the Gazette was the first one I could find online that carried this advertisement for the services of an enslaved portraitist, and it also carried ads for enslaved humans themselves, like this man who was advertised as part of an estate sale. To be sold by said executor, an extraordinary good Negro fellow, about 21 years of age, also 4 pair of bed screws, 1 pair of hand screws, a horse and chaise, a horse cart, about 12,000 of good dry boards, a large scale beam that will weigh a ton an end, and about 1,000 of weights. In the same edition of the paper, there were 2 ads listing young black girls to be given away for free to new enslavers. One's listed as being 2 months old, and no age is given for the other, who's just described as a very likely hardy female Negro child of as fine a breed as any in America. So in one breath, we see an enslaved painter who's described as possessing extraordinary genius, another enslaved man who's treated as household furniture, and 2 enslaved children who are deemed literally worthless. From a primary source like this, it's a lot easier to draw general conclusions about the practice of slavery in Boston in 1773 than it is to gain specific knowledge about the life of any enslaved individual, like our painter. Luckily, we have another strong clue to the identity of the enslaved painter. Thanks to Phillis Wheatley, we know that there was an African-American portrait painter who was working in Boston at around this time. Phillis Wheatley was kidnapped from West Africa when she was about 7 years old, brought to Boston, and enslaved by the Wheatley family. Unlike many enslavers in Boston, Susanna Wheatley encouraged Phyllis's natural creativity and knack for language. Soon, she was reading not only English, but also Latin and Greek, and she began composing poetry as a teenager. Now about 20 years old, she was considered a highly skilled poet. She had just returned from a trip to Britain with her enslaver's son looking for a publisher for a book of poetry, and later that year she'd be manumitted, or released from slavery. In her now famous 1773 book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, she included a poem titled, To S.M., a young African painter on seeing his works. In the florid style that was so popular among poetry lovers at the time, it includes the lines, Still wondrous youth, each noble path pursue, on deathless glories fix thine ardent view. Still may the painters and the poets' fire to aid thy pencil and thy verse conspire. Though Phillis Wheatley doesn't identify the wondrous youth beyond the initials SM, there are additional clues that let us name the painter as Scipio Moorhead. In an essay about searching for the details of Scipio's life in the historic record, historian Eric Slaughter wrote, It is in fact only from Phillis Wheatley's poem that we have any knowledge that Scipio Moorhead was a painter. A manuscript note left in pencil by Daniel O'Connor, a white reader, and his copy of Wheatley's poems on various subjects, indicates that Wheatley's poem, To S.M., a young African painter on seeing his works, was addressed to Scipio Moorhead, a black, quote, servant whose genius inclined him that way, unquote. The materials for narrating Moorhead's life are few. The fact that someone wrote a poem to him is the only thing that truly distinguishes the archival traces left by or around this particular person from the traces of many other enslaved persons whose lives remain largely invisible to us. The Wheatleys and the Moorheads were neighbors and friends, and there's been speculation that both the enslaved painter Scipio and the enslaved poet Phillis found mentorship in the household of Reverend John Moorhead and his wife Sarah Parsons Moorhead. Phillis Wheatley became famous in both the colonies and England after writing an elegiac poem after the death of Reverend George Whitefield. Whitefield was one of the first itinerant ministers, one of the founders of the Methodist Church, and one of the founders of the evangelical movement. His ministry inspired the Great Awakening that helps explain why the United States remains such a heavily religious nation even today. Though Johnny Moorhead was a prominent Scots-Irish Presbyterian, both the Wheatleys and the Moorheads were influenced by Whitefield's teaching, and Sarah Moorhead had composed poems about the minister in the past. Professor Wendy Raphael Roberts, who's made a career of studying Phillis Wheatley, compares the language Wheatley used in her elegy for Reverend Whitefield to the language Sarah Moorhead had earlier used, and she concludes that Sarah Moorhead helped to nurture the creative impulses in both young artists. Claims have been made for the Reverend Mather Byles as a poetic mentor for Wheatley, an idea that's now commonplace. My comparison of Whitefieldian poems suggests that Wheatley found another poetic mentor in the revival supporter Sarah Moorhead. Given the friendship between the Moorhead and Wheatley families, and Moorhead's mentorship of her own slave, Scipio Moorhead, and his artistic pursuits, an active mentorship, rather than only poetic emulation, was quite possible. The Moorhead household cultivated art and poetry as part of its religious experience, and understood them to be tools for steering the winds of a revival. It would have been a natural extension of Sarah Moorhead's religious and artistic vision to take the young Wheatley under her wing as well. As she was significantly older than the painter, Phillis Wheatley probably had a hand in Scipio's artistic education herself, and Slaughter speculates about another potential source. In the 1760s, Scipio might have found a mentor of sorts in Pompey Fleet, a slave in the household of the Boston publisher Thomas Fleet. Pompey Fleet's woodcuts for the Prodigal Daughter, made around 1750, may have been copied from a lost English source. They were subsequently recopied by other engravers, including a young Isaiah Thomas, who later wrote about Pompey in his History of Printing in America. Much as it might seem strange to advertise the extraordinary genius of an enslaved painter alongside enslaved children who were seen as literally worthless, it also seems strange to both tutor these young people in the arts, recognize and encourage their incredible skill and creativity, and yet enslave them. In his book, The City-State of Boston, past podcast guest Mark Peterson explains the mental gymnastics that families like the Moorheads and the Wheatleys performed to justify enslaving people who they clearly recognized as having inherent value in humanity. They were all believers in liberty, but their definition of the term, a Protestant Christian liberty, was complex. This liberty was not licensed to do what one lists, but freedom to know what is right and to do good. This was a freedom rooted in submission to an omnipotent God's authority and acceptance of Christ's love, demonstrated in his substitutionary atonement for humankind's sins, which transformed believers from slaves of sin into free and active servants of God's divine purpose. As chief beneficiaries of the commercial prosperity that Bostonians wrung from the Atlantic trade, the members of this circle shared the luxury to treat people they claimed to possess as privileged servants, like Phillis or Scipio, rather than as field hands. In these circles, the practice of African chattel slavery was a serious but murky problem. As we've seen, as early as 1700, Samuel Sewall argued that the slave trade was inherently wrong, legalized man-stealing, and no more justified than the selling of Joseph by his brothers. Other 18th century Bostonians justified slavery on the grounds that it was wrong to leave a continent in darkness, untouched by Christianity, and neglect the souls of those unfortunates already captured into slavery and deposited on American shores. Some, like Harrison Gray, Joseph Sewall, and Andrew Elliott, minister of the New North Church, were actively opposed to slavery, refused to own slaves themselves, and spoke out against the institution. Others, John Wheatley and John Moorhead among them, saw no contradiction between owning slaves and treating them humanely as Christians, just as they would servants in less permanent forms of bondage. So perhaps Sarah Moorhead believed she was doing the humane thing when she enslaved a young African boy in 1760 and gave him the name Scipio. In his essay, Eric Slaughter explored the slim details of Scipio's early life that can be gleaned from historic sources, writing, "On June 11, 1760, a group of white Bostonians presented a black child they called Scipio Saracen to an Anglican minister for baptism. While it's possible to reconstruct fundamental facts about the white players in this ceremony, and even about the setting in which it took place, the child at its center remains largely invisible. King's Chapel, a stone building sometimes called the masterpiece of the first architect of British America, may itself have been partially constructed by unfree black laborers. Once inside the building, social conventions segregated black and white parishioners. In the recent past, numerous whites had brought children of African descent to Reverend Henry Kaner for baptism. Thomas Hayes, one of Scipio's sponsors, was a cordwainer or shoemaker. He held the title to a pew in King's Chapel and had served as a witness in the infant baptisms of at least 2 other slaves before Scipio Saracen, including Reverend Kaner's own slave, Pompey. 6 years later, Kaner would baptize Hayes' slave, Crispin. Scipio's other sponsor was Sarah Parsons Moorhead, a published poet who had occasionally taught children how to draw, paint, and embroider. Sarah Moorhead was married to the pastor of the Presbyterian Church, Reverend John Moorhead. The surviving baptismal record describes Scipio Saracen as a Negro servant to Reverend John Moorhead. But in late colonial New England, a Negro servant was synonymous with a slave. Sarah and John owned Scipio. His origin is as unclear as his age. Scipio is one of the names most frequently given to newly imported black male slaves by white masters in New England in the middle of the 18th century. The names of classical worthies and gods that white masters gave to black men in 18th century British America, Scipio, Cato, Caesar, Bacchus, Pompey, Neptune, Nero, and Jupiter were the most common such names in Boston, marked even baptized slaves as pagan or pre-Christian, and served to ironize the power dynamic between slaveholders and slaves. Slaughter points out that one of the details that cannot be gleaned from historic sources is Scipio's age. When Phillis wrote about him in 1773, she was about 20 years old, and her references to him as a youth indicate that she was at least a little bit older than him. If he was an infant when he was baptized in 1760, he might have been as young as 13 years old. If so, his skill as a portraitist is even more impressive, because many people believe that he created the portrait of Phillis Wheatley that ended up being transposed to an engraving and used as the frontispiece for her book of poetry. When her enslaver Susanna Wheatley fell ill, Phillis had to cut her 1773 trip to England short, returning to Boston before she could secure a publisher for her book of poems. In her absence, Captain Robert Califf, acting as the Wheatley's agent, continued to search for a sponsor. In a letter to the family, he reported that Selina Hastings, the Countess Huntington, was interested in financing the publication, but she had a couple of requests. I'd like to forget to mention to you, she's fond of having the book dedicated to her. But one thing she desired, which she said she hardly thought would be denied her, that was to have Phyllis's picture in the frontispiece, so that if you would get it done, it can be engraved here. I do imagine it can be easily done, and think would contribute greatly to the sale of the book. I am impatient to hear what the old Countess says upon the occasion, and shall take the earliest opportunity of waiting upon her when she comes to town. At the Countess's request, a portrait was made of Phillis Wheatley, which is usually attributed to the hand of Scipio Moorhead. Then that portrait was made into an engraving. Some articles about Scipio Moorhead state that he traveled to London to make the plate for the engraving himself, but I couldn't find any period sources to support that claim. If he created the likeness of Phillis, it's likely that he sketched or painted her portrait, and the original was lost after being sent to London and used to create a plate. The remaining engraving is considered the first portrait of a woman writer at work in the Americas. In a 1996 article for the William and Mary Quarterly about 18th century representations of African Americans, Barbara E. Lacey describes the unusual nature of this portrait. The frontispiece portrait in poems on various subjects, religious and moral, is believed to be based on the work of black painter Scipio Moorhead, a member of the household of the Reverend John Moorhead of Boston and a friend of Phillis Wheatley. The frontispiece shows a slim young woman seated in a curved-back chair at an oval table with a quill pen, inkwell, book, and writing paper. She's writing, but has stopped and lifted her head to compose the next lines. Her eyes look off, but not at the world around her. She is inwardly directed, reading her thoughts. Yet the inscription on the portrait's border identifies her as Phillis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. She's presented to English readers as a woman of refinement, a poet, and a servant. An improbable, thought-provoking combination of roles. I thought that the marginal note by Daniel O'Connor that Eric Slaughter told us about might have been the only reference to Scipio by name during his own era. But past podcast guest J.L. Bell turned up one more in conjunction with John Moorhead's death. The Reverend passed away in December of 1773, and Phillis Wheatley penned a new poem in his memory. Addressed to Mary Moorhead, Sarah and John's daughter, the Elegy to Miss Mary Moorhead on the death of her father, the Reverend Mr. John Moorhead, focused on the dual loss suffered by the Moorhead family and Reverend Moorhead's church. Written in a more simple style than the Ode to Scipio, it includes straightforward couplets like, "Thine and the church's sorrows I deplore. Moorhead is dead, and friendship is no more." In the weeks after the minister's death, a printer named William McAlpine set the poem in type and sold it as a broadsheet in the streets of Boston. Into the void left by Moorhead's passing stepped Reverend David McClure. McClure was an itinerant minister. In the early months of 1774, he'd preached from pulpits in Salem, Newburyport, and at Portsmouth, Exeter, and Dover, New Hampshire. His diary entry for April 28th notes that while in Portsmouth he received an invitation to supply the pulpit of the late Venerable Mr. Moorhead in Boston. The next entry in his diary from May 4th shows just how closely McClure had stepped into the late Johnny Moorhead's shoes. Put up at the widow Moorhead's. Found the place convenient for study. The family small. The widow is unhappily deranged. The distraction is of the melancholy cast, silent and averse to company or society. She was once an accomplished wit and beauty, tenderly beloved by her husband. Her distraction was thought to be the effect of an uncommon flow of spirits and lively imagination too intensely applied to reading and study. One son and 2 daughters survive. The son Alexander is now a surgeon in the British Navy in Boston Harbor. Her daughter Mary takes care of her poor mother. A Negro young man does the housework. Scipio is an ingenious and serious African. He possesses a natural genius for painting and has taken several tolerable likenesses. In quoting this passage for a 2016 blog post about Scipio, J.L. Bell notes, "It's a pity that McClure attributed Sarah Moorhead's depression to too much reading and study, rather than, say, the death of her husband less than 6 months before." That would seem to be the last word on the so-called Negro man of extraordinary genius, who was advertised in 1773 as taking faces at the lowest rates in Boston. Scipio, who was enslaved by the Moorhead family, was a gifted visual artist who had a friendship with the much more famous Phillis, who was enslaved by the Wheatley family and who was also a gifted poet. Case closed. Or maybe not. In the early 2000s, another enslaved artist who was active in Boston at the same time began to re-emerge from the archives. One of the founders of the Hingham Historical Society in the early 20th century gave the organization a huge collection of antiques that she had inherited. Among the collection were portraits of Henry and Christian Barnes, along with the collected letters of both. Christian Barnes especially was quite a letter writer, writing to her husband when he was away, to friends and acquaintances in Boston after the Barnes family moved from Boston to Marlborough, and later in life, even to one of the 3 African Americans whom the family had enslaved. Henry Barnes ran a distillery, and he manufactured pearl ash, or potassium carbonate, which was used as a leavener before the invention of baking powder. Longtime fans will remember that Eben Horsford of Boston first developed baking powder in the 1860s, then used his fortune to promote the crackpot theory that Vikings had originally settled the Charles River Valley. Learn more about him in episode 17. Barnes used the profits from his own leavening agent to buy an estate in Marlborough, as well as purchasing at least 3 African Americans who were enslaved as household servants. Among them was a woman named Daphne, who enters the historical record briefly in May of 1745, when she was baptized at Trinity Church in Boston. Church records note that she was an adult, and that her son Prince was baptized alongside her. Prince, we should note, is another very common name for enslaved men in New England, and like Scipio, it was intended to ironize the power dynamic between slaveholders and slaves. While Daphne was taken to Marlborough when the Barnes family moved there, it appears that Prince was not. He may have been raised in the household of one of Christian Barnes' relatives in Hingham, but he's not mentioned in her letters until November 1769. In a letter on November 20th, she wrote, "Daphne's son Prince is here, and I'm sitting to him for my picture. He has taken a copy of my brother's extremely well, and if mine has the least resemblance, I shall have a strong inclination to send it to you, purely for the curiosity, though it's nothing but a daub, for he has not proper materials to work with." Apparently, she approved of his artistic talents, because 3 days later, Christian noted in a letter that Henry had purchased Prince, saying, "I believe he has some design of improving his genius in painting." In both the understatement of the year and a commentary on the inhumanity of slavery, she adds, "Daphne appears to be much better reconciled to a state of slavery since her son's arrival. Upon the whole, I believe there is not a happier set of Negroes in any kitchen in the province." Christian Barnes put Prince to work practicing his portraiture, at first as a novelty, and within a few months she wrote, "Were I only to descant on the qualifications of my limner, it would be a subject for several sheets. He is a most surprising instance of the force of natural genius, for without the least instruction or improvement, he has taken several faces which are thought to be very well done. He has taken a copy of my picture, which I think has more of my resemblance than Copley's. He is now taking his own face, which I will certainly send you, as it must be valued as a curiosity by any friend you shall please to bestow it upon." The word limner in this context just means a portraitist. Since Barnes already compared his work favorably to John Singleton Copley's, one of the most celebrated portrait artists of the 18th century, it must have been pretty good. Ms. Barnes noted that Prince was working with pastels on blue paper, and was desperate to find better materials for him to work with. She wanted to get him decent paints and some instruction, because already in March 1770 she saw Prince's paintings as a potential money-making operation, writing, "If you should meet in your travels with anyone who is a proficient in the art, I wish you would make some inquiries into these particulars, for people in general think Mr. Copley will not be willing to give him any instruction, and you know there is nobody else in Boston that does anything at the business. And I should likewise be obliged to you if you could employ some friend who is a judge of those things to purchase a small assortment of crayons, with other materials proper to the business, that he may be kept employed in this way till he has made some further improvement. And then I intend to exhibit him to the public, and don't doubt that he will do honor to the profession." Apparently her husband Henry had a reputation for get-rich-quick schemes, because she quickly added, "You laugh now and think that this is one of Barnes' schemes, but you're quite mistaken. It's entirely my own. and as it is the only one I ever engaged in, I shall be greatly disappointed if it doesn't succeed. Christian Barnes must have found some proper paints and canvas for Prince to practice with, because before long she thought that his skills were coming along well enough for the family to make a significant investment in them. After he had been enslaved in the Barnes household for just over a year, Prince would accompany Henry Barnes on an extended trip to England. In February 1771, Henry wrote to a family friend named Elizabeth Murray, "Prince comes on extremely well. He is with a Mr. Pine." Historians believe this was Robert Edge Pine, who has taken him purely for his genius. Mrs. Wright tells me I shall carry him a treasure to America. An article for Antiques magazine, co-written by Amelia Peck of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Paula Bagger of the Hingham Historical Society, explains that Prince was not in London long, but the trip exposed him to new experiences and attitudes. Pine was a supporter of English radical politics and the American independence movement, while the Barnes family was loyalist. The abolition of slavery was an issue of growing importance in England. The following year, an English court held that slavery was not supported by English common law, and a number of free black men were achieving prominence in the arts and letters. It has been suggested that Pine's father, the noted engraver John Pine, was black or of mixed race, and this may have affected Prince's relationship to his teacher. Certainly the new experiences and attitudes that they encountered in London affected Prince's relationship with Henry Barnes. Barnes became increasingly paranoid that Prince might try to escape while he was in the less repressive environment of Old England. In his 1771 letter to Elizabeth Murray, Henry wrote, "I have met with so many disappointments in life that though late I have learnt not to be too sanguine in my expectations. Indeed, his life and situation are so precarious, if he should even attempt his freedom, it would give me such a disgust to him, I should not overlook it. I want you should return with Bill, for I do not let him converse with any of his own color here." Henry had become so fixated on the risk of Prince self-emancipating if he was able to make contact with his fellow black Londoners, that he was considering taking on the expense of bringing another enslaved man from home all the way across the Atlantic to keep Prince company, with the probably spurious assumption that a black New Englander would be more docile. Instead, he ended up taking Prince back to Massachusetts, which would not become a hotbed of the Underground Railroad and other abolitionist activities for over a half-century. The article by Peck and Bagger describes Prince's return to Boston. In March 1772, Christian reported that Prince had taken 5 pictures from life since his return, 3 of them as good likenesses as ever Mr. Copley took, and that she planned a trip to Boston to recommend our limner to the public. In January 1773, the ad began running in the Boston Gazette for the enslaved portraitist who takes faces at the lowest rates. That February, a Scottish textile merchant named William Duguid sat for Prince, and 237 years later, it caught the eye of Amelia Peck, a curator of decorative arts at the Met. In the article she co-authored with Paula Bagger, she explains how she first encountered the work of Prince de Ma Barnes. At first glance, the small oil portrait of a handsome man in a flowered dressing gown looked somewhat unprepossessing. Hanging on the wall of a dealer's booth at an antiques show in 2010, it had a folksy appeal, but wasn't an obvious candidate for acquisition by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. However, as a curator in the midst of developing an exhibition concerning the worldwide textile trade between 1500 and 1800, I was particularly taken with the chintz banyan worn by the sitter and asked for more information about the picture. The dealer had it on consignment from a person who had purchased it from the family of the subject, William Duguid. It had traveled down through 5 generations before being sold. In its original frame, the painting was accompanied by a heart-shaped brooch thought to be the one pinned to Duguid's gown. The stretcher, a part of the frame, was signed by the then unknown Prince de Ma Barnes and dated 1773. The whole package proved so appealing that we brought the painting to the museum for examination and further research. It was certainly a rare example of a vernacular American portrait painted before the Revolutionary War. Initial research in the basic sources didn't reveal any mention of an artist named Prince Dama Barnes. But after finding evidence that William Duguid was a Scottish immigrant textile merchant who advertised his imported goods in the Boston papers in the early 1770s, I was convinced that we needed to acquire the painting. It would be an interesting addition to the American Wings collection of 18th century portraits, especially in comparison with contemporary works by Boston artists like John Singleton Copley, and would be a terrific addition to my upcoming textile exhibition, Interwoven Globe. Prince Dama Barnes may have been unknown to Peck and the art historians at the Met, but he was well known to Paula Bagger and the Hingham Historical Society. Since the early 2000s, Bagger, an attorney and the director of the Historical Society, had been researching Prince's life through the Barnes family letters and other correspondence in Boston area archives. By this time, she knew about his 1745 baptism, his 1769 purchase by the Barnes family, and his improving artistic skills through the early 1770s. From the letters, she was convinced that the portraits of Henry and Christian Barnes in the Hingham collection had been painted by Prince, but there was no solid proof. In her own article about this project, Bagger wrote, "We got in touch with the Metropolitan and were able to share what we had learned about Prince. The Met invited us to bring our 2 portraits to its paintings conservation department, where they were examined using X-radiographs and infrared reflectography. The Met concluded that its signed painting by Prince and our 2 Barnes portraits were all by the same artist." Unfortunately for almost everyone involved, the discovery of Prince's artistic talent played out against a backdrop of the rush to revolution. Christian Barnes's letter describing Prince's natural genius and his amazing portrait work, even though he only had blue paper and pastel crayons to work with, was written 2 weeks after the Boston Massacre. The Barnes family were staunch loyalists and Tories, and they tried to ignore the writing on the wall for as long as possible. In part, they managed this by having Henry decamp to London for several months with Prince, as his refusal to boycott British goods brought more and more scrutiny. When they returned, Prince painted the portrait of William Duguid, then Elizabeth Smith that summer, and probably the portraits of the Barneses around the same time. That winter, the Boston Tea Party took place. Before long, it was time for the Barnes family to leave. Someone destroyed the family coach, burned Henry in effigy, and broke all the windows of his manufacturing house. Some accounts say that the Sons of Liberty tarred and feathered Henry's horse, and he eventually received a letter threatening far worse treatment. "If you only want recompense for the damage you have done the country in importing goods contrary to the agreement of the body of merchants on this continent, I will recompense, for I am determined to fetch you to terms, even if I do it at the expense of my own soul, or the cost of a sore back, or any other punishment in this world, only for the good of my country, for I style myself a son of liberty. Therefore, if you will shut up your store and sell nothing out, nor import any goods, you shall sustain no more damage. But if not, I will fire your house and store, and destroy all your substance you have on the earth. And I will take your body, and I will tar it. And if nothing else will do but death, you shall have it certainly." The article in Antiques magazine describes how the Barnes family finally made their escape. They left for England in late 1775. Their goods were confiscated, and Henry was banished by the Act of the General Court in 1778. Most of their possessions, including the family portraits and Daphne, Prince's mother, were left at their Marlborough estate. The portraits of Henry and Christian both have damage in the area of the paintings where their hearts would have been. The lore is that they were attacked by the Patriots who came to seize the estate. Prince considered himself a free man after the Barnes family fled Boston, but whether legal papers to this effect were signed is unknown. In April 1777, Prince, now just Prince Dama, enlisted in Colonel Thomas Craft's artillery regiment of the Massachusetts militia. As an editorial aside, Christian Barnes had been confident back in 1770 that young Prince shared the family's Tory principles, writing, "This surprising genius has every qualification to render him a good servant. Sober, diligent, and faithful, and I believe as he was born in our family that he is of Tory principles, but of that I am not quite so certain as he has not yet declared himself. Enslavers could internalize the ritualistic deference that enslaved household servants had to show to their owners to such a degree that the owners never questioned that their chattel might disagree on anything of importance. Yet Prince Dama's enlistment as a matras, or assistant gunner, in a Patriot artillery regiment shows how far from the truth Christian Barnes's declaration of his Tory principles actually was. The article continues, his name appears in regimental records through early 1778. Likely he fell ill. The regiment's barracks in Boston's West End were close to the provincial hospital, and smallpox was endemic. And on March 11, 1778, he wrote his will. As Prince Dama, limner, and a free Negro, he left all he had to his mother, Daphne Dama. 1 week later he died, his burial recorded at Trinity Church. We may never know which enslaved African-American man was actually advertised in the Boston Gazette as taking faces at the lowest rates, but both candidates experienced profound changes in their lives in 1775. The lead-up to war in that year also proved to be a turning point in the life of Scipio Moorhead. Sarah Parsons Moorhead is believed to have died sometime in late 1774. And the Boston Gazette and Country Journal of January 2, 1775 includes this notice. To be sold by public auction on Thursday next at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. All the house furniture belonging to the estate of the Reverend Mr. John Moorhead, deceased, consisting of tables, chairs, looking glasses, feather beds, bedsteads and bedding, pewter, brass, sundry pieces of plate, etc., a valuable collection of books, also a likely Negro lad. The sale to be at the house in Auchmuty's Lane, South End, not far from Liberty Tree. In a cruel irony, the advertisement that includes Scipio, the likely Negro lad, is strikingly similar to an ad that appeared in the same paper 2 years before. In the same edition as the ad for the enslaved painter who took faces at the lowest rates, an estate auction offered for sale a good Negro fellow, about 21 years of age. If he had never met Phillis Wheatley, Scipio would have likely remained just as anonymous as the 21-year-old fellow who was being sold in that 1773 ad. And after his sale out of the Moorhead family in 1775, he became that anonymous again. There's no more record of the young African painter who Wheatley called a wondrous youth after that 1775 sale. The Dartmouth, where Phillis Wheatley's books and Scipio Moorhead's portraits made the voyage to America, was one of the 3 tea ships to arrive in Boston at the end of 1773. Another aspect of the events that led up to the Tea Party that I didn't really know about until relatively recently is that there weren't just 3 tea ships. Along with the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, cargoes of tea were also sent to New York, Philly, and Charleston, South Carolina. There was also a 4th tea ship bound for Boston, the William. This 4th ship wrecked off of Race Point at the tip of Cape Cod, but the cargo wasn't entirely lost. In this clip from January of this year, you'll learn how Boston's first street lamps were recovered from the storm-tossed wreck. I've always had a soft spot for the old-timey gas street lamps that are found in a handful of historic Boston neighborhoods. I'm not talking about the old-fashioned street lights that you might see on the paths through Boston Common or around the Charlestown Navy Yard. The ones with the round, frosted glass globe atop a metal pole are electric lights that were manufactured to look like old gas lamps. The ones I'm talking about are entirely angular, with no curved glass at all. They have a metal pole that tends to be smaller in diameter and simpler in design than the ones supporting those electric lights, or sometimes a metal elbow attached to a building. At the top, a metal armature angles up to support the lamp, which is set in a square metal base. On each side of the square, trapezoidal glass panes reach up and out, and then 4 more trapezoidal panes angle up and back in, making the square fixture flared out in the middle and transparent on all 4 sides. So to recap, if you see a round base with a round frosted glass globe, that's an electric light. If you see a square base with transparent angular glass panels, that's a gas lamp, at least for now. The dead giveaway, however, is that you can clearly see the fabric mantles inside the clear housing burning brightly with a warm, white gas flame. I love how, on the streets that use gas lamps, even the red lamps marking fire call boxes are gas. Look out for them the next time you're walking around City Square in Charlestown, Marlborough Street in the Back Bay, a few blocks around Bay Village, or of course Beacon Hill. Even though there are really just a handful of streets using gas lamps, they're such a clear symbol of historic Boston that back when co-host Nikki and I operated a walking tour company, we used the profile of one of these lamps in our company logo. Despite being an iconic symbol, however, they're not Boston's original street lamps. The first gas lamps were installed in Boston in 1828, and the city wasn't fully converted to gas lighting until the 1880s. Gas lamps are not the beginning of Boston's history with streetlights, however. To find the first Boston streetlights, we have to go back to the series of crises that led up to the American Revolution. I was inspired to look into the earliest Boston streetlights by a talk about the Boston Massacre. In March of 2022, Katie Turner Getty gave a talk around the massacre anniversary about the women who bore witness to the bloody massacre in King Street. Her description of the physical surroundings of the confrontation were very evocative, and one of the things she focused on was the darkness of the night. My mental image of the Boston Massacre is shaped by two things: the Paul Revere engraving of the event and the annual reenactment held each March. In both cases, the participants are well lit, by modern streetlights in the case of the reenactment, and by Revere's imagination in the case of the engraving. In reality, however, the massacre occurred on a cold winter's night that would have been nearly as dark as a night camping in the White Mountains. With no streetlights, the sentry and the rowdy crowd surrounding him would have been lit only by the moon, the stars, and perhaps by a bit of lamplight spilling out from under someone's door or between their shutters. Getty pointed us to a late 19th century print of the massacre by Walter Gilman Page, which portrays the events unfolding in an inky darkness, with the old State House barely silhouetted in the moonlight, and the faces of the colonists illuminated only by the first muzzle flash as the redcoats fire into the crowd. I'll include that image in the show notes, and I think it'll change how you picture the massacre. That isn't to say that there were no attempts to shed a little light on the streets of Boston before that time. In an essay about lanterns in early America published in a 1904 edition of the Connecticut Magazine, C.A. Quincy Norton describes the scattershot approach to lighting the city's streets in Boston's early years. The streets of ancient Boston were not regularly lighted until 1774, although for a number of years before this date there were many private lanterns, either over the front doors of the larger houses or near the gates opening onto the main streets. A few of the more pretentious stores also maintained lanterns in front of their doors during the winter months. There was, as early as 1695, several large iron cressets, or fire baskets, on the corners of some of the most frequented streets. These were kept supplied with pine knots by the night watchman, and by their flickering, smoky light, assisted this official in the discharge of his duties. The first organized approach to street lighting for Boston is tied to another of the crises that helped precipitate our revolution. In the weeks leading up to the event that we remember as the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, Boston nervously awaited 4 tea ships. The Dartmouth arrived first on November 28th, followed by the Eleanor on December 2nd. The Beaver arrived in the outer harbor on December 7th, but there had been a case of smallpox on board during the journey, so she was ordered to anchor at Rainsford Island for a week until the sickness was gone. The Beaver's move from the outer harbor to Griffin's Wharf on December 15th was the immediate trigger for the destruction of the 3 cargoes of tea the next night. The 4th tea ship, known as the William, never arrived in Boston. 5 nights earlier, she had encountered a strong gale, gotten blown off course and drifted dangerously close to the Cape Ann shore. On the night of December 10th, Captain Joseph Loring fought the wind and waves for hours, nearly sinking within sight of the twin lights on Thatcher Island. Then he beat for open water with the hope of trying again another day. He followed the wind southeast, trying to break out of the tight confines of Massachusetts Bay for the relative safety of the open Atlantic. He was unsuccessful. 1774 author Mary Beth Norton described the resulting wreck in a 2016 paper. Almost exactly 24 hours after the near disaster at Cape Ann, the William once again encountered waves breaking on a lee shore. This time, Loring could not sail the vessel away from the coast, so he ordered the anchors to be let out. She rowed to her anchors about half an hour, the sea running very high and wind blowing more violent on shore, he recalled. The William then drifted onto a sandbar where the anchors held the ship for several more hours. Around 9 o'clock on the morning of December 11th, the tide peaked, the storm continued, and the surf began to break over the vessel. By then, the hold was awash with 4 feet of water, and the ship's pumps were proving inadequate. In desperation, Loring decided that it was impossible for her to remain any longer in this condition without loss of the vessel and cargo, and our own lives. And so, at his orders, the crew cut the anchor cables. Just a few minutes later, the vessel ran onto shore about 2 miles east of Race Point, at the tip of Cape Cod, on what are now known as the Peaked Hill Bars, more than 39 nautical miles from Cape Ann and north of the town of Truro. The first notice of this wreck ran in the Boston newspapers on December 16th, probably getting lost in the news of that evening's tea party, when a group of patriots dressed in crude Native American costumes destroyed the cargoes of tea that had arrived in Boston. A few days later, another piece ran in the December 20th Boston Gazette and Country Journal. Captain Loring, in a brig from London for this place, having 58 chests of the detested tea on board, was cast ashore on the back of Cape Cod last Friday. 'Tis expected the Cape Indians will give us a good account of the tea against our next. That fate was exactly what the legal owner of the tea was trying to avoid. After seeing news of the shipwreck in the papers, tea consignee Richard Clark's son Jonathan rowed as quickly as he could to the Outer Cape to salvage the William's cargo. Despite pressure from the local patriots, he was eventually able to gather the tea safely in Provincetown, with a little bit of assistance. While Clark made the 119-mile ride, Justice of the Peace John Greenough took charge of the salvage operation. He compensated the local laborers who took on the job by dividing the contents of one damaged tea chest among them. The night after the work was completed, December 18th, another storm hit Race Point, and what was left of the William was completely destroyed. Local captains from P-Town and Truro refused to load the salvaged tea on their vessels, but eventually Clark and Greenough convinced the captain of a Salem schooner to transport 51 chests of tea to Fort William at Castle Island for safekeeping. Clark paid Greenough for overseeing the salvage operation with 2 chests of tea. One of the chests was seized and burned by P-Town patriots, while the other was offered for sale by a shady character a few months later, as reported in the Connecticut Journal. Lyme, March 17, 1774. Yesterday, one William Lamson of Martha's Vineyard came to this town with a bag of tea, about 100 pounds, on horseback, which he was peddling about the country. It appeared that he was about a business which he supposed would render him obnoxious to the people, which gave reason to suspect that he had some of the detestable tea lately landed at Cape Cod. And, upon examination, it appeared to the satisfaction of all present to be a part of that very tea. Whereupon a number of the Sons of Liberty assembled in the evening, kindled a fire, and committed its contents to the flames, where it was all consumed and the ashes buried on the spot, in testimony of their utter abhorrence of all tea subject to a duty for the purpose of raising a revenue in America. A laudable example for our brethren in Connecticut. The 51 chests of salvaged tea reached Castle Island on January 4th, 1774. By then, most of the tea consignees who'd witnessed the mob's rage over tea 2 weeks before had gotten cold feet, and the tea sat unsold. By March, much of it had been seized by the Customs Service for non-payment of the controversial duties. It's possible that some of Richard Clark's tea had been redistributed for sale, and that it might have been among the tea that was burned by Boston patriots in a second, smaller tea party on March 8th. Of course, tea was not the only cargo carried by the despised tea ships. Very famously, the Dartmouth was carrying the first edition of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, the first volume of poetry by Phillis Wheatley. But there were also other perfectly mundane cargoes aboard all the tea ships. According to Norton's account, the William also carried medicines, black pepper, and glass bottles. Most importantly to our story this week, however, it carried about 300 of the first streetlights for Boston. In a postscript to a letter he wrote to a friend in which he describes the destruction of the tea, Boston merchant John Andrews noted on December 19, 1773, "I give you joy of your easy riddance of the baneful herb, being just informed by the arrival of the post that it's gone from whence it came. I forgot to acquaint you last evening that Loring, in a brig belonging to Clark, one of the consignees, is on shore at the back of Cape Cod, drove thither by a storm last Friday week, who has the last quota of tea for this place, being 58 chests, which completes the 400. It's unlucky that Loring has the lamps on board for illuminating our streets. Am sorry if they are lost, as we shall be deprived of their benefit this winter in consequence of it." Bostonians were deprived of street lamps during the winter of 1773, but they wouldn't be deprived forever. The lamps on their way to Boston were the product of a series of town meetings that culminated in a vote in favor of acquiring street lamps on May 11, 1772. Citizens of Boston voluntarily contributed money by subscription to pay for the new lamps, so all that was needed was enabling legislation. That, in turn, was passed in July 1773, and authorized the purchase of lamps for enlightening the streets, lanes, alleys, or passageways in the town of Boston. Why this required an act of the state legislature, I'm not quite sure, but the new law does a good job of pointing out why the town needed lights. The enlightening of streets, lanes, alleys, and passageways in large and populous towns by lamps hung up in the nighttime is not only ornamental, but very advantageous to all such persons as have occasion to pass in and through the same about their lawful business, and tends greatly for the safety and preservation of the inhabitants by the discovery and prevention of fires, burglaries, robberies, thefts, and other lesser breaches of the peace. The first section empowers the selectmen of Boston to set up and affix such and so many lamps, and in such streets, lanes, alleys, and passageways in said town, for enlightening the same, as the town, or such persons as they may appoint, shall in their judgment think necessary, and for the common benefit. And the better to preserve and regulate such lamps, said selectmen are hereby empowered to appoint and contract with any person or persons for the lighting, cleaning, snuffing, and repairing the same. The second section mandates that anyone who accidentally damages a lamp or the post it's on will be liable for the cost of repair, and that anyone who deliberately damages or destroys one would face a fine of £20. In addition, if any person or persons sentenced to pay the aforesaid fine of £20 and costs shall refuse to pay the same, he or they shall be punished for the offense by being imprisoned not exceeding 6 months, or by whipping not exceeding 20 stripes. So do not plan on damaging a Boston street lamp. The selectmen were empowered to take down or remove any post or sign thereon in any street, lanes, alleys, or passageways in said town, or that now are, or hereafter may be, fixed or that adjoin to any dwelling house or building, in case they shall judge that any such post or sign tends to intercept or in any way lessen the light in said lamp. If the owner of the obstruction didn't comply within 48 hours, the selectmen could have someone remove the problem themselves and fine the owner 6 shillings for every day the obstruction remained. At the same time, the legislation reassured property owners that the owners of any lamps placed or set up in said town at their own private expense may at any time take down or remove the same, or extinguish the light thereof, anything in this act notwithstanding. Any fines levied against someone who violated the new law by leaving up a sign or post that obstructed the street lamps, or by deliberately damaging one of the lamps, were to be used for the upkeep and repair of the lamps. Well, half the fine would go to the repair budget. The other half would be paid out as a bounty to whoever informed on the person who violated the law. If the town thought that more lamps, repairs, or other supporting equipment were necessary beyond what the fines would pay for, the final section of the law authorized them to levy a tax on all residents to pay for them. With the authorizing legislation in place, it was up to the selectmen of the town of Boston to appoint a committee to oversee street lighting, and it would be left up to that committee to come up with a plan. Luckily for us, one of revolutionary Boston's most reliable diarists was appointed to be part of the committee. Boston merchant John Rowe's diary records his first day on this duty. March 1st. Afternoon I spent at Faneuil Hall with the committee about lighting the lamps. Present were myself, Henderson, Inches, William Phillips, Benjamin Austin, and Mr. Appleton. And yes, that is probably the same Benjamin Austin whose son fought a bloody duel to defend his honor in 1806. You can listen to episode 216 from February 2021 for more about that story. Over the course of the next few meetings, the committee slowly gathered more members, some of whom have famous names. Rowe's diary records the addition of Deacon Ebenezer Storer of the Brattle Street Church on May 4th. Then even more members are named later in May as the committee divided the city into lighting districts and chose locations for the lamps. May 18th. Attended the committee about fixing the lamps. We finished the north part of the town, number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 divisions. Present were myself, Deacon Phillips, Deacon Storer, Thomas Gray, Mr. Appleton, Major Dawes, to which were the gentlemen of the several wards, Mr. Jonathan Brown, Mr. John Leach, Mr. Paul Revere, Mr. Edward Proctor, Mr. Thomas Hitchman. May 24th. This day I went with the committee about the lamps to view the wards number 6, 7, and 8, which we finished. I'm sure you recognize Mr. Paul Revere's name there. A half-dozen books and articles I looked at named John Hancock as a member of this committee as well, but I wasn't able to find his name in Rowe's diary. I'm not sure at what point exactly the committee decided that the lamps needed to be ordered from England, but they did. They selected lamps that had metal bases and glass tops, not too dissimilar from today's gas lamps. The difference, of course, is that the earlier street lamps did not burn pressurized gas delivered from centralized gas lines. Instead, they had a metal oil reservoir at the bottom, a metal burner that held an adjustable fabric wick, and then a glass shade above to shelter the small flame from the wind. All the parts of the lamps, minus the poles or elbows that they'd be mounted to, were manufactured in England. The order had to cross the Atlantic in one direction, then the lamps had to be manufactured, procured, and loaded onto a ship along with some tea to cross the Atlantic in the other direction. It appears that Boston's street lamps were salvaged alongside the tea that washed up at Race Point in December 1773. Though I couldn't find the exact date, they were brought back to Boston around the first of the year. In John Rowe's diary, there's a gap in the discussion about the committee for the lamps for a few months following their September meeting, until the next meeting is noted on January 8, 1774. On that same day, Boston craftsman Thomas Newell's diary notes, began to make the tops of the glass lamps for this town. So it appears that although the glass for the street lamps was destroyed in the wreck of the William, the lantern bases were recovered and restored locally. With the oil lamps in Boston and almost ready for installation, the Street Lighting Committee kicked into high gear in January 1774, with Rowe's diary recording meetings to discuss the details of installing the lamps and how they'd be operated each day. January 19th. I attended the carpenter and blacksmith in marking out the places the lamps are to be fixed. January 20th. This forenoon, the selectmen and the committee for the lamps met at Faneuil Hall. We consulted on the method of lighting them and had a long conference with Mr. Smith for that purpose. An appendix to a book about, of all things, gas manufacturing plants in Massachusetts contains this critique of early street lamps, highlighting the very manual method of lighting them that the town came up with. They were dim, erratic, sometimes blew out in high winds, smoked up their glass enclosures with soot, occasionally caught fire, and tended to cast local pools of light rather than illuminating a long swath of road. And they had to be manually lit and extinguished each day by roving lamplighters equipped with poles and ladders. The lamplighter trade originally developed to service streetlights that burned whale oil or naphtha, introduced in Boston in 1773 and paid for out of public subscription, and continued as these were replaced by gas lights. As that paragraph points out, the new street lamps were fueled by whale oil, which burned brighter and whiter than the competition and had the added benefit of being provided by the vast Nantucket New Bedford whaling fleets. After over a decade of street lamps in Boston, John Adams describes a conversation that he had with British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger in a 1785 letter. Promoting American whale oil as a trade good for import into Britain, Adams wondered why, despite having introduced street lighting into London nearly a century before Boston, the English seemed to prefer an inferior fuel. He praised the crime-fighting nature of the bright white light of Boston's street lamps, which was provided by American whale oil. There could not be a doubt that spermaceti oil might find a market in most of the great cities of Europe, which were illuminated in the night, as it is so much better and cheaper than the vegetable oil that's commonly used. The fat of the spermaceti whale gives the clearest and most beautiful flame of any substance that's known in nature, and we are all surprised that you prefer darkness and the consequent robberies, burglaries, and murders in your streets to the receiving as a remittance our spermaceti oil. The lamps around Grosvenor Square, I know, and in Downing Street too, I suppose, are dim by midnight and extinguished by 2 o'clock, whereas our oil would burn bright till 9 o'clock in the morning and chase away before the watchman all the villains and save you the trouble and danger of introducing a new police into the city. Every day, a Boston lamplighter would make his rounds, probably within a single lighting district. In the morning, he had to extinguish the preceding night's lamps, fill the oil reservoir, and trim any wicks that needed it. That evening, he'd make the rounds again, carrying a lantern and a piece of reed or straw that could transfer a flame from his lantern to each street lamp, at least until friction matches became common in the mid-1800s. The first time that Boston's lamplighters made their rounds was in March of 1774. In his diary entry for March 2nd, Thomas Newell, the craftsman who had repaired the lamps, wrote, "A number of lamps in town were lighted this evening for the first time. 2 responsible persons from each ward have been appointed to decide, with the approval of the General Committee, upon the most fitting locations in which to place the new lanterns." John Rowe's diary entry for the next day, March 3rd, simply states, "Last evening the lamps were lighted for the first time. They burnt tolerable well." The Massachusetts Gazette of that same day gives a sense of how many lamps were available for the first lighting. Last evening, 200 or 300 lamps, fixed in several streets and lanes of this town, were lighted. They will be of great utility to this metropolis. C.A. Quincy Norton's essay about lanterns in early America gives us a sense of where these first 200 or 300 lamps were located. From a careful reading of the historical notes relating to matters that detailed events of this period in Boston, it is evident that these street lanterns were distributed over an area of perhaps not more than a mile in either direction from the old State House. No description of these lamps has been found in any of the ancient records of Boston. The presumption is that they were small, tin-framed lanterns, and that they were suspended from iron cranes that were secured to buildings on the corners of the most frequented thoroughfares. At the end of the first month of street lighting, John Rowe and the members of his committee wound down their service. Rowe's last diary entry on the subject describes how they delivered their final report. March 30th. Town meeting this morning. I was chose moderator. We delivered in our reports respecting the erecting and fixing up the lamps in this town. It was accepted. In 1828, the Boston Gas Company erected a single gas lamp on a pole in Haymarket Square. Meant as a demonstration lamp, this privately owned fixture was the first outdoor gas lamp in the city of Boston. Gas was centrally supplied, so a lamplighter wouldn't have to fill the oil reservoir on each lamp every day. The cloth mantles didn't require daily trimming and rarely burned out. And gas could be delivered so cheaply that it eventually became more economical to leave the lamps running than to pay someone to light them every day. In 1834, the city made the leap, installing the first public gas lamps around Faneuil Hall. Over the next few decades, gas slowly replaced oil in the streets of Boston. From the 1830s on, nearly all new streetlights were fueled by gas. By the 1890s, there were conversion kits to easily convert the last few oil lamps over to gas, while electric arc lights marked a few city squares starting in the 1880s. A summary written by Marta Crilly of the City Archives describes how Boston converted from gas to electric street lighting at the beginning of the 20th century, and then, surprisingly, began converting some areas back to gas a few years later. In 1909, the city began installing tungsten electric lamps. 3 years later, in 1912, tungsten electric lamps began to replace existing naphtha lamps. By 1913, all gas lamps in Boston proper had been converted to electric. The following year, all lamps in Lower Roxbury were converted to electric. Although the city used electric lamps in Boston proper and areas of Roxbury, it continued to use gas lamps in its residential districts. The last gas lamps were installed in residential districts in 1948. During the 1940s, mercury vapor electric lamps were also installed on many of Boston's major streets. During the first half of the 20th century, outside vendors maintained the city's gas lamps, but in 1958, the city took over gas lamp maintenance. 4 years later, the city began to change electric lamps in historic neighborhoods back to gas lamps. Electric to gas changeovers continued into the 1990s. So despite being an iconic symbol of historic Boston, most of the gas lamps that we see on the streets of Boston today were newly installed during the mid-1960s. Perhaps they're not quite as historic as I thought. By 2010, which was the most recent figure I could find, the city of Boston owned about 67,000 streetlights, most of which have been converted over to LED in the past few years. About 2,800 gas lights remain in service, and some of these now have an automatic solar mechanism that allows them to be shut off during the daytime. In a 2019 interview with Boston.com, Dan Webb of the city's street lighting division described the maintenance that the remaining gas lamps require. First of all, the cloth mantles need frequent replacement. At best, they last about a year, and they're easily damaged by everything from falling ice to a car bumping up against a light pole. The glass tops of the lamps are also easily destroyed by falling ice, and they're constantly being slowly obscured by soot. Webb noted that unbroken clear glass panes are usually replaced about once a year, but explained that it can be more frequent in some areas, saying, "When you have a lot of tourists in the city, you want it welcoming. You don't want them dirty. So we actually try to step up the game and keep the areas where the tourists are real clean. And then during the week, we'll maintain the other areas." Beginning in the spring of 2022, the Wu administration started examining the possibility of converting our nostalgic old gas lamps to LED. In March, they installed a single LED assembly into an existing gas lamp on Stewart Street in Bay Village. It's designed to cast a very warm light, like the gas burner that it replaces, rather than the bluish light that we get from most LED streetlights. They're supposed to remain basically maintenance-free for 7 to 10 years, rather than requiring the fairly constant stream of work that their gas counterparts need, saving the city about $200,000 a year. Replacing our gas streetlights would also eliminate a common source of the many constant gas leaks around the city, which kill street trees, as well as perhaps posing a safety risk. The gas, whether it's burned or leaked, also contributes to climate change, and that's what's driving this initiative. In March of 2022, the city's chief of streets, Joshua Franklin Hodge, told the Globe, "The planet's facing a climate emergency, and the only way to address that is to transition off fossil fuels. We want to do our part to replace our terribly inefficient gas lighting with something that's compatible with a sustainable climate." Mayor Wu hopes to replace all the city's gas lights with LED. Michael Donahue, the city's street lighting and asset manager, told the Boston Sun, "Our goal is to replicate what was installed here. We use this type of burner assembly throughout the city. The goal is to have a sense of consistency." Perhaps predictably, neighborhood associations in the neighborhoods with gas lamps are opposed to the change. In Beacon Hill, which has the most gas lamps of any area of the city, the neighborhood association is just as flatly opposed to LED lighting as they were to ADA-compliant wheelchair ramps. In the Back Bay, the new light assemblies are seen as just a bit too red to be installed on Marlborough Street. Meanwhile, in Bay Village, the head of the neighborhood association said that there wasn't really a problem with the new light assemblies, as long as the lamps in Beacon Hill and the Back Bay are converted first, so Bay Village doesn't end up with one-off lights. Well, that about wraps it up for this week. To learn more about the enslaved artist Scipio Moorhead, and about Boston's first street lamps, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/290. I'll have tons of primary sources for both of this week's stories, including letters, diaries, and newspaper articles about Boston's need for street lamps and the search for the right lighting source. I'll also have letters and articles about Boston's enslaved portraitists, as well as the original advertisement for Scipio Moorhead's talents. This week, I'll also include some pictures of my dearly departed Duke, from some of his earliest days with us to his lovely last weekend, and from walks in the woods to cuddles on the couch. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and still most active on Twitter, although barely active there either. If you're on Mastodon, you can find me as @hubhistory@better.boston, or just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop me a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.